Mark Thompson had always been a man of big dreams and even bigger appetites. Growing up in a small town in Texas, he spent most of his life hearing stories about faraway places, cities with towering landmarks, bustling streets, and rich histories. London was at the top of his list. The idea of walking through centuries-old streets, seeing palaces, and tasting authentic British food excited him more than anything else. So when he finally saved enough money for the trip, he didn't hesitate. He packed his cowboy hat, his favorite pair of boots, and an oversized backpack filled with everything he thought he'd need for the adventure of a lifetime. The flight to London was long but worth it. As soon as Mark stepped off the plane, he felt a rush of excitement. The airport buzzed with people from all over the world, speaking different languages and carrying suitcases covered in stickers from their travels. Mark grinned to himself, thinking, "This is it, the start of my dream vacation." After collecting his bags, he hopped into a cab that whisked him away to a cozy little hostel near Buckingham Palace. His room wasn't fancy, but it was clean and close enough to the city's famous attractions. Perfect. Once settled, Mark wasted no time exploring. He wandered around the streets, marveling at double-decker buses, red phone booths, and street musicians playing cheerful tunes. Every corner seemed like something out of a movie, and Mark couldn't stop snapping photos on his phone. By late afternoon, his stomach started rumbling. So he ducked into a nearby pub. It was warm inside, with wooden walls and dim lighting. A chalkboard menu listed classic British dishes like fish and chips and shepherd's pie, along with a variety of beers brewed locally. Mark ordered a pint of ale, eager to try something new. At first, he sipped slowly, letting the rich flavor settle on his tongue. But as the hours passed, the lively atmosphere of the pub got the better of him. Laughter filled the air as locals swapped jokes and tourists shared stories of their adventures. Before he knew it, Mark was ordering another round, and then another. With each drink, his confidence grew. He started chatting with strangers at the bar, telling them exaggerated tales of his travels. "You should have seen me in Paris," he boasted, leaning back in his chair, climbed the Eiffel Tower in record time. Of course, the truth was much less exciting. He'd only made it halfway before getting winded, but nobody called him out on it. By early evening, Mark was feeling good, maybe too good. His words came out louder and slurred, and his movements became clumsier. Still, he didn't notice. Instead, he decided it was time to check out one of London's most iconic traditions, the changing of the guard ceremony at Buckingham Palace. Armed with his last pint of beer, he stumbled out of the pub, completely unaware of how much alcohol was clouding his judgment. Little did he know, this decision would lead to a moment he'd never forget, or forgive himself for. As Mark made his way toward Buckingham Palace, the streets were alive with energy. Tourists from all over the world milled about, snapping photos and pointing excitedly at the grand architecture of the palace. Street vendors sold souvenirs, miniature red phone booths, Union Jack flags, and postcards featuring the royal family. The air buzzed with anticipation as people gathered near the gates to catch a glimpse of the famous changing of the guard ceremony. Mark joined the crowd, weaving through groups of families, couples, and schoolchildren clutching notebooks for their trip reports. The scene was picturesque. The palace stood tall and majestic against the evening sky, its golden windows glowing softly in the fading sunlight. Nearby, a group of musicians played cheerful tunes on bagpipes, adding to the festive atmosphere. Mark couldn't help but grin as he took it all in. Despite his slightly unsteady gait and the growing warmth in his cheeks from the beer, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. "This is so cool," he muttered to himself, raising his pint for another sip. His eyes scanned the area until they landed on something that caught his attention, a line of royal guards standing perfectly still in their bright red coats and towering bearskin hats. Their stoic expressions and precise posture fascinated him. Mark had seen pictures of them before, but seeing them up close was something else entirely. He leaned closer to get a better look, accidentally bumping into a woman holding a camera. "Sorry," he said with a sheepish grin, though his slurred words earned him a disapproving glance. One particular guard stood just a few feet away from him, motionless as a statue. His polished boots gleamed under the soft glow of the streetlights, and not a single hair seemed out of place beneath his hat. To Mark, who was now several pints deep, the guard's unwavering stance seemed almost otherworldly. How do they even stand like that? He wondered aloud, tilting his head as if trying to solve some great mystery. Without thinking, he stepped closer, squinting as though inspecting the guard for clues. "Hey, buddy, what's your secret?" Mark called out, raising his voice above the chatter of the crowd. When the guard didn't respond, Mark laughed, thinking it was part of the act. "Oh, come on. You can talk, right? Or are you, like, programmed or something?" A few people nearby turned to look at him, some rolling their eyes while others chuckled nervously. Mark didn't notice, or maybe he didn't care. Emboldened by the attention, he continued making jokes, gesturing wildly with his hands. His half-empty pint sloshed precariously in its glass as he waved it around, drawing more stares. The guard remained silent, his face unreadable. Mark found this hilarious. "Man, you're good," he said, clapping his free hand against his thigh. "Like, really committed to the role. Respect." He leaned in again, squinting dramatically. "But seriously, don't you ever get bored? I go nuts standing here all day." Still no reaction. Mark shrugged, grinning wider. "All right, Mr. Serious Pants, I see how it is." What Mark failed to realize was that his loud antics were starting to irritate those around him. Parents shushed their kids and pulled them closer, while older tourists shook their heads in disapproval. Even the street performers paused mid-song, exchanging glances as if silently asking, "Is this guy for real?" But Mark, lost in his own world, was oblivious to the mounting tension. All he could focus on was the guard in front of him, and the next move he planned to make. Mark's confidence was at an all-time high as he continued to entertain himself and unintentionally annoy everyone else by poking fun at the royal guard. He swayed slightly on his feet, gripping his pint glass like it was a microphone, and launched into what he thought was a hilarious impersonation of the guard's stiff posture. "Look at me," he declared, puffing out his chest and sticking his chin up in exaggerated imitation. "I'm a super serious guard who doesn't even blink." A few people chuckled awkwardly, but most just looked away, clearly unimpressed. Still, Mark didn't pick up on the cues. In his mind, he was the life of the party, a charming traveler bringing humor to an otherwise formal event. The alcohol clouded his judgment, making him believe that everyone around him shared his amusement. Encouraged by his own laughter, he took another step closer to the guard, waving his hands dramatically as he spoke. "Come on, man, give him something," he said, leaning forward as if expecting the guard to crack a smile or nod in acknowledgement. When nothing happened, Mark shrugged theatrically and turned back to the crowd. "Tough audience," he quipped, earning only a few polite chuckles from the more forgiving spectators. But then, disaster struck. As Mark gestured with his arms once again, his foot caught on a crack in the pavement. For a split second, he teetered, arms flailing as he tried to regain his balance. His eyes widened in panic as gravity took over, pulling him forward. Before anyone could react, Mark stumbled directly into the guard, spilling half of his beer onto the pristine red coat. The golden liquid splashed across the fabric, soaking into the material and leaving a dark, wet stain. The crowd gasped collectively, their murmurs filling the air like static. Some people covered their mouths in shock, others pulled out their phones to capture the moment. Time seemed to freeze as Mark stood there, frozen in disbelief at what he'd just done. For a brief moment, the guard didn't move, not even a twitch. His face remained completely expressionless, as though nothing had happened. But Mark knew better. This wasn't just any spill. This was a major blunder, one that couldn't be ignored. "Oh crap," Mark muttered under his breath, his earlier bravado melting away instantly. He glanced around nervously, noticing the sea of disapproving faces staring back at him. Parents whispered urgently to their children, ushering them farther away from the scene. Tourists shook their heads, muttering phrases like "unbelievable" and "so disrespectful." Even the street musicians stopped playing altogether, their instruments resting silently at their sides. Trying to salvage the situation, or maybe just ease his own embarrassment, Mark slapped the guard lightly on the shoulder and slurred, "Oops. My bad, mate. Didn't mean to do that." His tone was overly casual, as if he were apologizing for bumping into someone at a bar, rather than defiling the uniform of a member of the Queen's Guard. The guard still didn't respond, standing tall and unmoving as though carved from stone. Mark laughed nervously, scratching the back of his neck. "You're really good at this whole no-reaction thing, huh?" He joked weakly, hoping to lighten the mood. But no one laughed, not even the kids clutching their parents' hands. Instead, the tension in the air grew thicker, pressing down on Mark like a heavy blanket. He realized too late that his words weren't helping. If anything, they were digging him deeper into trouble. As the whispers among the crowd grew louder, two figures emerged from the sidelines. Military police officers, dressed sharply in uniforms that commanded immediate respect. They moved with purpose, their boots clicking against the pavement as they approached Mark. One of them placed a firm hand on his arm, while the other gave him a stern look that sent a chill down his spine. "Sir, you need to come with us," one of them said curtly, leaving no room for argument. Mark's heart sank as reality hit him like a freight truck. This wasn't just a funny mishap anymore. It was serious. And as the officers led him away from the ceremony grounds, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just made the biggest mistake of his trip. The walk to the security office felt like the longest of Mark's life. Flanked by the two military police officers, he stumbled slightly as they guided him through the now silent crowd. People stared at him with a mix of disbelief and disapproval, some shaking their heads while others whispered loudly enough for him to hear. "Unbelievable," one woman muttered under her breath. A man nearby added, "What an idiot." Each word cut deeper than the last, but it was the silence from the guard that weighed heaviest on Mark's mind. As they stepped away from the ceremony grounds, Mark tried to explain himself, his words tumbling out in a jumbled rush. "Look, guys, I didn't mean anything by it. It was just an accident. Honest. I tripped and my beer." "Well, you saw what happened." He glanced up at the officers, hoping for even a flicker of understanding. But their faces remained impassive, unreadable masks of professionalism. One of them simply said, "Save it for later," which made Mark's stomach twist into knots. They entered a small, nondescript building near the palace grounds. Inside, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. The warm buzz of the tourist-filled streets outside was replaced by cold efficiency. The room smelled faintly of polished wood and paper, and the walls were lined with framed certificates and official-looking documents. At the center of the space stood a desk where another officer sat waiting, his uniform crisp and immaculate. His nameplate read Lieutenant Harris, and his sharp eyes locked onto Mark the moment he walked in. "Sit down," Lieutenant Harris instructed, pointing to a chair across from him. Mark obeyed, sinking into the seat as if its weight might anchor him to reality. The lieutenant leaned forward, folding his hands neatly on the desk. "Do you have any idea how serious this is?" he asked, his tone calm but firm. Mark opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He had a vague sense that spilling beer on a royal guard wasn't exactly polite, but he hadn't considered it could be more than just embarrassing. Harris continued, his voice steady and measured. "These guards represent centuries of tradition, discipline, and service to their country. They are not here for entertainment or amusement. What you did today was disrespectful, not only to the individual guard, but to the institution itself." As the words sank in, Mark felt a lump rise in his throat. He wanted to argue, to say that it was all just a silly mistake, but deep down, he knew the officer was right. To make matters worse, Harris pulled out a tablet and showed Mark footage of the incident captured by bystanders. There he was, stumbling around drunk, laughing too loudly, and finally spilling his beer in full view of dozens of people. Watching himself on screen hit him like a punch to the gut. He barely recognized the person in the video, a loud, obnoxious stranger who seemed completely unaware of his surroundings. "This has gone viral online," Harris added, tapping the screen. "It's being shared worldwide. You've brought shame not only to yourself, but also to your country." Mark slumped further in his chair, feeling smaller with every passing second. "I'm sorry," he mumbled, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know. I didn't think. It was just—" His sentences trailed off, unfinished and inadequate. He wanted to explain that he wasn't usually like this, that he respected traditions and cultures, but the words felt hollow even to him. How could he justify drunkenly mocking someone whose job was to protect a national symbol? Lieutenant Harris studied him for a moment before speaking again. "Apologies aren't enough here, Mr. Thompson. This kind of behavior carries consequences. We'll need to document everything and determine appropriate action. Depending on the severity, this could result in fines, legal charges, or even restrictions on your ability to visit certain sites in the UK." Mark's heart sank further. Restrictions, legal charges. He hadn't thought about any of that when he'd set out that morning, excited to explore London. For the first time since arriving in the city, Mark felt truly sober. The haze of alcohol faded, replaced by a crushing sense of regret. He realized now that his actions weren't just harmless fun. They had real-world implications. And as he sat there, listening to the lieutenant outline the next steps, he couldn't help but wonder how he'd let things spiral so far out of control. The next morning, Mark woke up with a pounding headache and a sinking feeling in his chest. The events of the previous day replayed in his mind like a bad movie he couldn't turn off. He remembered stumbling into the guard, spilling beer all over his uniform, and being led away by the military police. But what haunted him most was the look on Lieutenant Harris's face. Calm, professional, and utterly unforgiving. It wasn't anger that scared Mark. It was the disappointment, the sense that he had let down not just himself, but everyone around him. By mid-morning, Mark found himself sitting nervously in a small courtroom, waiting for his case to be called. The room was quiet except for the occasional shuffle of papers or the murmur of lawyers discussing cases in hushed tones. Mark fidgeted in his seat, his hands clasped tightly together as if trying to hold himself together. He glanced around at the other people in the room. Some looked anxious, others indifferent, but none seemed as out of place as he did. With his cowboy hat tucked under his arm and his rumpled clothes, he stuck out like a sore thumb. When the judge finally called his name, Mark stood up slowly, his legs feeling like jelly beneath him. As he approached the front of the courtroom, he caught glimpses of reporters scribbling notes and photographers snapping pictures. News of his drunken mishap had spread quickly online, turning him into an overnight sensation. For all the wrong reasons, headlines like "Drunk Tourist Humiliates Royal Guard" and "American Causes Chaos at Buckingham Palace" flashed through his mind, making his cheeks burn with shame. The prosecutor laid out the charges: public intoxication, disorderly conduct, and defacement of a Royal Guard's uniform. Each accusation felt heavier than the last, piling onto Mark until he thought he might collapse under their weight. When it was his turn to speak, he cleared his throat and addressed the judge, his voice trembling. "Your Honor, I want to say again how sorry I am. I never meant to disrespect anyone or cause trouble. I was careless, and I made a huge mistake. I'm truly, deeply sorry." To Mark's relief, the judge didn't seem entirely unsympathetic. She nodded thoughtfully before responding. "Mr. Thompson, your apology is noted. However, actions have consequences, especially when they involve cultural institutions as significant as the Queen's Guard. Your behavior has not only embarrassed yourself, but also tarnished the reputation of visitors from your country." Her words stung, but Mark knew she was right. He nodded earnestly. willing to accept whatever punishment came his way. After a brief deliberation, the judge handed down her decision. Mark was fined heavily, a sum that would leave a noticeable dent in his travel budget, and ordered to write a formal letter of apology to the regiment involved. Additionally, he was banned from entering certain historical sites in the UK for the remainder of his trip. While the restrictions weren't as severe as jail time, they still hit hard. For someone who had dreamed of exploring London's landmarks, being barred from them felt like a cruel twist of fate. As Mark left the courtroom, the reality of his situation began to sink in fully. His once exciting vacation now felt tainted, overshadowed by guilt and regret. Reporters shouted questions at him as he walked outside, but he ignored them, keeping his head down and clutching the court papers tightly in his hand. The stares and whispers followed him all the way back to his hostel, where he collapsed onto his bed, exhausted and overwhelmed. For hours, Mark stared at the ceiling, replaying the judge's words in his head. He realized now that this wasn't just about paying a fine or writing an apology letter. It was about accountability. His actions had consequences far beyond what he'd imagined, affecting not only his own life, but also the lives of those around him. And as much as he wanted to rewind time and undo everything, he knew that wasn't possible. All he could do now was take responsibility and try to make things right. Little did Mark know, this moment of reckoning would mark the beginning of a journey towards self-awareness and redemption, one that would change him in ways he never expected. Back at his hostel, Mark sat alone on the edge of his narrow bed, staring blankly at the crumpled court papers in his hands. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of traffic outside and the occasional creak of footsteps from neighboring guests. His backpack lay open on the floor, its contents spilling out, a jumble of clothes, maps, and souvenirs that now felt meaningless compared to the weight of what had happened. Mark's mind raced as he tried to process everything. The spilled beer, the stern lecture from Lieutenant Harris, the courtroom full of judgmental eyes, and the judge's final verdict. It all felt surreal, like a bad dream he couldn't wake up from. But it wasn't a dream. It was real, and Mark knew he had to face it head-on. He sighed deeply and reached for the small notebook he brought with him for jotting down travel memories. Flipping it open to a fresh page, he picked up a pen and hesitated. Writing the apology letter wouldn't be easy. How do you put into words something so humiliating and embarrassing? How do you express genuine remorse when your actions have already been mocked online and criticized by strangers around the world? After a few moments of staring at the blank page, Mark began to write. At first, his sentences were clumsy and awkward, but as he continued, they became more heartfelt. To the members of the Queen's Guard, he started, "I am deeply sorry for my behavior yesterday. What I did was disrespectful, thoughtless, and completely unacceptable." He paused, tapping the pen against his chin before continuing. "I understand now that being part of the Guard is not just a job. It's an honor, a tradition, and a symbol of service to your country. By spilling beer on one of your uniforms, I showed no respect for any of that, and I regret it more than I can say." Mark went on to explain how alcohol had clouded his judgment and led him to act recklessly. He admitted that he hadn't taken the time to learn about the significance of the changing of the guard ceremony, or appreciate the discipline required to serve in such a role. "I was selfish and immature," he wrote. "I let my excitement get the better of me, and I ended up making a fool of myself and offending many people in the process." As he neared the end of the letter, Mark's handwriting grew more deliberate, each word carefully chosen. "I hope you'll accept my apology, not because I expect forgiveness, but because I genuinely want to make amends. I've learned a hard lesson here, and I promise to carry it with me wherever I go. Thank you for your patience and professionalism during this difficult situation." He signed off with his name and added a shaky line beneath it before setting the pen down. Exhaling slowly, Mark leaned back against the wall, feeling a mix of relief and unease. The letter wasn't perfect, but it was honest, and that was the best he could offer. Still, he knew an apology alone wasn't enough. He wanted to do something tangible to show he meant what he said. Scrolling through his phone, he searched for local charities that supported veterans and active duty military personnel. One organization stood out, a group dedicated to helping wounded soldiers transition back into civilian life. Without hesitation, Mark sent them an email offering his time as a volunteer. Over the next few days, Mark threw himself into volunteering. He spent hours sorting donations, packing care packages, and assisting with community events hosted by the charity. It wasn't glamorous work, but it gave him a sense of purpose he hadn't felt since arriving in London. The staff and volunteers welcomed him warmly, unaware of his recent brush with infamy, and their kindness reminded him that second chances were possible, even after mistakes as big as his. One afternoon, while organizing boxes of supplies, Mark struck up a conversation with a veteran named James who worked part-time for the charity. They talked about London, travel, and eventually, the importance of respecting traditions. When James mentioned how much pride he took in serving his country, Mark nodded silently, guilt washing over him again. Though he didn't share the specifics of his story, he listened intently, absorbing every word as if it were a lifeline pulling him toward redemption. By the time his volunteer shift ended, Mark felt a glimmer of hope. He realized that while he couldn't erase what had happened, he could use it as motivation to grow, to become someone who approached the world with humility and gratitude instead of carelessness and arrogance. And though his trip hadn't turned out the way he planned, he knew it would stay with him forever, not as a source of shame, but as a turning point that changed him for the better. Mark's final days in London were a blur of reflection and small, quiet moments. The bustling city that had once seemed so vibrant and full of promise now felt different, quieter, almost somber. He spent less time exploring tourist hotspots and more time wandering through parks, sitting on benches, or watching the Thames flow lazily past. Each step he took was accompanied by thoughts of what he'd done and how it had changed him. For the first time in his life, Mark wasn't rushing to check items off a bucket list or chasing after the next big adventure. Instead, he was slowing down, allowing himself to process everything. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Mark found himself at Hyde Park. He sat on a bench near the Serpentine Lake, watching families stroll by and couples holding hands. A street musician played a soft melody on his guitar nearby, the notes drifting gently through the air. It was peaceful, a stark contrast to the chaos of the past week. Mark pulled out his notebook again, flipping to the page where he'd written his apology letter. Reading it over, he realized how much he'd grown since penning those words. They weren't just an apology. They were a confession, a promise to himself to be better. That night, back at the hostel, Mark decided to call home. Talking to his parents had always been comforting, even if he didn't share every detail of his trips with them. This time, though, he wanted to tell them everything: the good, the bad, and the ugly. When his mom answered the phone, her cheerful voice immediately brought tears to his eyes. "Hey, Mom," he said softly, struggling to keep his emotions in check. "I messed up." His mom listened patiently as Mark recounted the entire story, from the pub crawl to the courtroom verdict. There were long pauses where she didn't interrupt, letting him speak without judgment. Finally, when he finished, she sighed deeply but spoke kindly. "Mark, we all make mistakes. What matters is what you do next. You've already taken steps to fix things, and that says a lot about who you are." Her words hit him like a warm hug, wrapping around him and easing some of the guilt he'd been carrying. The next morning, Mark received an email from the charity where he'd volunteered. They thanked him for his help and invited him to stay involved, even offering suggestions for similar organizations back in Texas. Reading their message filled him with a sense of accomplishment he hadn't expected. For so long, he'd thought of traveling as a way to escape routine and experience new things. But now, he understood that true growth came not from ticking boxes on a map, but from connecting with people and learning from experiences, even the painful ones. Before leaving London, Mark made one last stop: Buckingham Palace. Standing across the street, He watched silently as another changing of the guard ceremony unfolded. This time, he kept his distance, observing respectfully without cracking jokes or drawing attention to himself. As the guards marched in perfect formation, their movements sharp and synchronized, Mark felt a deep sense of admiration. He thought about the discipline it took to stand tall and composed, no matter what happened around them. It was a lesson he hoped to carry forward into his own life, to face challenges with dignity and grace. On the flight back to Texas, Mark stared out the window, watching clouds drift by. His backpack felt lighter this time, not because he'd left anything behind, but because he was carrying fewer regrets. The trip hadn't gone as planned, but it had given him something far more valuable: perspective. He realized that mistakes weren't failures unless you refused to learn from them. And while he couldn't undo what had happened, he could use it as fuel to become a better version of himself. When the plane touched down, Mark stepped off with a renewed sense of purpose. He knew his journey wasn't over, it was just beginning. Mark's return to Texas was quieter than he expected. The familiar sights of his hometown, the dusty roads, the neon signs of local diners, and the sprawling fields, felt both comforting and strange after his whirlwind adventure in London. At first, he kept to himself, avoiding social gatherings and steering clear of questions about his trip. He wasn't ready to share the full story yet, not even with his closest friends. Instead, he spent his days reflecting on everything that had happened, replaying moments in his mind, and trying to piece together how they'd shaped him. But as weeks turned into months, Mark began opening up. One Friday evening, he found himself at a barbecue hosted by his neighbor, surrounded by friends swapping travel stories over plates of ribs and cornbread. When someone asked casually, "Hey, Mark, how was London?" he hesitated for a moment before deciding it was time to tell the truth, or at least part of it. "Well," he started, leaning back in his chair with a wry smile, "it wasn't exactly the dream vacation I'd planned." His friends leaned in, intrigued. Mark recounted the highlights of his trip: the historic sites, the lively pubs, and the vibrant culture. But he didn't shy away from the low points either. He told them about the night he got too drunk, the embarrassing incident with the Royal Guard, and the harsh consequences that followed. By the end of the story, the group was silent, unsure whether to laugh or sympathize. "It sounds like you learned a lot," one friend finally said, breaking the tension. Mark nodded, his expression serious but calm. "Yeah, I did. Probably more than I wanted to, honestly. But I'm glad it happened because it made me realize how important it is to respect other people's traditions and boundaries, even if you don't fully understand them." Word of Mark's experience spread quickly through town, partly because he shared bits of the story whenever someone asked, but also because he embraced the lessons he'd learned instead of hiding from them. He started giving talks at local schools and community centers, using his story as a cautionary tale about responsibility and cultural sensitivity. "Traveling isn't just about seeing cool places," he'd say during these presentations. "It's about learning, growing, and treating others with kindness and respect. And sometimes, it's about owning up when you mess up." To everyone's surprise, Mark's story resonated deeply. Parents praised him for turning a negative experience into something positive, while kids listened wide-eyed as he described the grandeur of Buckingham Palace and the discipline of the Queen shop.